Hi, I'm Lasse Rindom, and I appreciate you listening in to this episode of The Only Constant. Sharing is caring, and it means a lot. If this episode sparks a thought with you, pass it on. You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Dr. Christina Strauss, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi, Christina, and welcome to The Only Constant. I'm super happy to have you here today, and I've been looking forward to this episode for a long time. Also, because we've spoken over the last couple of months and had some nice interactions. So this is going to be a really great episode. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lasse. I'm very happy to be here, and I always was looking forward to finally speaking with you on the podcast. So very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And, Christina, should all companies and organizations really think about AI at this moment, or should some perhaps start a completely different place in their digital efforts right now?
That's a very good question. I think everyone should at least focus a bit on what impact AI will have on their companies and on their people. Because actually, what we've seen a lot is that we have had in the past, had lots of companies that failed brutally because they only had an inside perspective. For example, if you take Kodak, for example, and I hate calling companies like these in the first minute, but it has something to it, because if they only had an inside perspective, as I think in many cases they might have had actually, they could have thought something like, well, we don't really need that new technology because everything's working out fine. And in many companies, that's what's going to happen. So even if processes are working perfectly, there will still be a need for AI, maybe because competitors might have it. And of course, that's where you should have maybe a more holistic view of maybe AI is not just this typical hype and we should maybe focus on it. But at the same time, I think, well, whenever it comes to AI, and I think you know that better than many other people, everyone says, yeah, it's super important. We should start with AI and everything should be AI based. And you had a very, very nice graphic, I think, on one of your posts saying, hey, that's an AI powered pen. So that's just, I think it was you that just sell it because it's AI powered, and there was no sense in it. And so that's, I think, where your question might, from my perspective, point towards, because of course, if you're not ready for AI, you should start with different things like getting a data structure, getting the right data for AI, because AI is no magic tool. It cannot say, oh, cool, you have a totally analog business model. Let's just use AI for that. And in the next half year, you're going to be the market leader in AI technologies. That's not what it should be in the end, but you should still have an eye on the development that comes with it, because it fundamentally changes how people think, interact, communicate, make decisions. And even if your company might not be ready to implement AI yourself or themselves, it might still be a super important point to see how the society and the competitors are changing. So I think you should at least focus a bit on that.
So you're basically saying, yes and no and maybe and all that. It's like, I like the way you said, the perfect imperfection to some extent. That's how I heard it. Everything's running perfect inside, but it's not perfect because in the whole, or compared to the external pressure, it's not good enough. It reminds me of, I had this conversation a little bit with um, uh, earlier in the podcast with Scott Newton, where I spoke to him about the high-level equilibrium trap. That is the theory in history that China didn't become modern because they were really good at being pre-modern. So they had no pressure to actually innovate, right? And it sounds a little bit like the same. So there's, but how do you identify this, Christina? How do you identify that there are some imperfections in your perfect processing? If okay, now we're assuming that some companies have perfect processing. I haven't met that yet, but how do you go from saying everything's okay to suddenly saying, okay, we need to look at this tool? So you are saying, sell the tool, or just 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 because because you need to have it, but there's no real need. How do we do that? Why do we have to do that?
That's that's harder than you might think. So, pointing to your first comment, I would say, to answer your question with one word, yes, you should think about it. Every company should.
Mm.
Because, of course, there's perfect imperfection, as you put it so nicely, but I don't even know if you need to focus on what's imperfect to kind of implement AI. Because even if if there were perfect processes or whatever it is, sometimes it can be even better or just different. And something different might not be perfect yet, but still work better for a certain customer, for a certain business model, and so on. For example, we had that customer like some month or no, even a year ago, and they were in the building business, and they had some very fancy ways to calculate how to build formulas for a certain application. And they said, okay, we have like 10,000, or that might be an acceleration, but they had 20 people just working on creating these formulas. And they had such a high knowledge that they said, okay, they have the perfect teaching, they have the perfect knowledge, and they will not do anything. Well, there will not be nobody might be doing something better than we are. But then they had a startup like pushing them out of the market in 1 month, because they had found a simulation tool to kind of simulate the formulas before testing them. So they had a different approach, which might have been less perfect, um, but in the end more successful. So what I'm
More viable,
trying
yeah.
to,
Mm.
yeah. So what I'm trying to get to is that in many cases you should have this openness to, maybe I can approach whatever I approached in the past differently in the future. And so
Mm.
you should keep asking yourself that question, and maybe also talk to people who are so far away from your original business model, but are experts in other fields, who might, I don't know, just have a different perspective on something. And I think this openness to new perspectives and new ways to approach topics and, yeah, processes as well, is something which is becoming more and more important.
Mm. So, but some companies, they even, I think I mentioned this previously in quite a few episodes actually, that there's a 70% digital transformation fail, right? According to McKinsey,
Yeah.
and I just still see companies where they receive a digital order, and then they print it, and then they go type it in a different machine,
Yeah.
right? And you're in Germany, Christina, so you don't have to comment on that. But this is something that is, but this is
I would
something.
love to.
But is it even what my question is also about? Is it even relevant for these kind of companies, these where they failed so um, abundantly almost on the first couple of digital waves, to start looking now at AI? Does it even make sense for them to do that? What do you think?
I think it is, but if you look at the statistics from McKinsey, I know the study as well, like the major reason why these transformations failed is because of the people. And of course, if you have people who are afraid of implementing new technologies, who just want to do it the old way, then of course you should still think about AI, but you should put the people first, because you can have the most powerful AI, you can have the perfect data, you can have the perfect process and the perfect external partners who help you implement AI. If the people in the organization are not willing to work with this technology and willing to change their behavior and also their mindset, their attitudes, and also their skill set, if they're not able to adapt, if they're not willing to learn, then it will not make any sense. But still, I think if you want to be successful in the long run, you should not focus on what hasn't worked in the past, but what could we work on or what should we work on first so that we can also implement AI.
But how do you? A lot of people said this with people, right? Start with the people. How do you do that?
Well, what I've made good experience with is just talking openly with the people who have like issues with AI. And most of them are not really saying, okay, I'm the one I'm the one stopping the process here. Those are the ones who usually cover it with very intellectual questions and doubts and saying, okay, I've made some calculations here and the AI will not do whatever it has done to other companies for our company because we are different, we are specific in whatever. And especially in these cases, it's not about kind of showing them that the numbers are wrong. It's about giving them some safety to experiment and safety about what's going to happen. Because actually, as you know, I work in AI, but I myself am still a bit afraid because, of course, it might change so much. And I think we've talked about that in one of the last calls that we had as well. But I think there is a reason why artificial intelligence has the word intelligence in it, because it can do way more than just telling you something like, I don't know what ChatGPT sometimes says, okay, I'm going to summarize you this email. And of course, this potential power makes us people afraid. And so I think giving people the comfort to experiment and to also approach AI in their own pace makes a huge difference here.
So the way we are approaching AI should be more conversation than just. It's not. I like that you said that it's not about the number because that was my question. So it's not just about showing them the technology works. It's something different,
Yeah.
right? That's what you're saying. It's a conversation. Change that way. It's a conversation with people where they can say, "I don't like it" or "I like it," and then go back and forth in that conversation, and then later on also be okay to maybe change their minds.
Yeah,
So that's the point,
absolutely.
right? But I see a lot of companies trying to just throw AI at their employees. And why do you think they do that? Here's a chatbot, be more productive, right? Or let's hope they get more productive or something. How do you think? Why do you think they do that? And what do you think a potential backlash could be from that kind of strategy?
To your first question, I think it's because they have or they fundamentally misunderstand how AI works.
Or maybe
Because
just thought that, like you said, that they should just start doing something with it.
yeah, and I think if you, for example, if you take a new email program or a new version of a technology, it might work that way.
Mm,
And of course, you can always say, okay, let's just try, and if it doesn't work, then we can talk to the people. And they don't understand is that you only have one or maybe two chances convincing people of the power of AI. And usually that doesn't work by showing them the program, but by showing them whatever it can do for them. So I think that's why it doesn't really work. And I think many people just are not aware of the implications of this development, because if they just say, okay, I'm going to throw that at you, to me, it's just uncertainty, because they say, okay, I don't have the capabilities, I don't have the time to tell everyone that this is a chatbot and so on. And I think many AIs are very close to things we think we know already. For example, a customer chatbot might be pretty close to these conversational AI chatbots now. What people don't understand is that it's fundamentally different in what they do actually. So of course they still answer your prompt or whatever you put in there, but when you want someone to work with AI and you give them a chatbot, in many cases you don't want him or her to say, oh cool, now I'm going to do everything with that chatbot. You want him or her to actually see the potential in
mm,
AI. And so I think the backlash of what your second question was, and I think that was also what you might have been thinking about as well, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you miss this chance of showing people what AI actually is, and then you kind of burn the first initial joy of experimenting with AI. What do you think about that? I would also be very interested in what you have to say to that.
Well, I think that there's I actually buy into the idea of the conversation around it, right? Starting to have these chats and talks and introducing people to it and listening in, and also sort of creating this open space, safe space where people can be both critical and positive around it, right? But at the same time, also because there's a I think I heard one of my clients recently say that, okay, we're done with these workshops and group discussions, right? Had enough of those, right, over the last couple of years, like tons of them. Now we want to see what can it actually do. Let's do something, right? It's because there is this weird discrepancy right now in the market as well between how much people say that the power of these tools are it's going to be immense, it's going to be great. You just said intelligence is there's some really big power here, and then the influence it actually has in everyday lives for most people. It's unless you actively seek it out, it's not there, right? It is there, but it's hidden. It's like this. There was this old saying that if it's called AI, it's probably PowerPoint. But if it's not called, if it's real product, it's something that it's not. It's not. It's you don't know it. It's not called AI when it's a product, right? If it's doing something, it's not called AI, but it's PowerPoint. If it's called AI, and there's something there still, right? So. Are people underwhelmed by not seeing it, not needing it, not being in their systems? While at the same time, tech bros are saying this is changing the world. We don't need to hire anyone. We stop hiring developers. There's just some there's some discrepancies there. I think that people are also experiencing that we need to overcome, and I don't think it's gonna be um, that easy. I think the backlash right now is of a hype market that has gone awry in the sense that um, it's created too much an expectation that tomorrow's technology will be better than we have today. So people are waiting for something big to just come and change the entire world, and that means that there's both a tech deflation. People are waiting for it to be better or cheaper tomorrow because it's better tomorrow, so they don't invest in it. At the same time, also just waiting for it to sort of show up and fix everything for them, right? And then not putting in the effort of actually having the conversations with their organizations, not putting in the effort to build into their data structures and their processes. Hype is, I always say the hype is only moving fast because it's frictionless. It doesn't touch anything. But as soon as it starts touching you and your enterprise, your processes, your people, your strategies, it slows down. Just the way it is, right? And that's slowing down. Do we want that? Are we willing to accept that? I think that's the big question right now.
Absolutely. And I think you said something very important here, because in many cases, I think people think just because it's AI that it would work completely autonomously without them being like involved in the process, without them putting in the effort that they need to put in, or without them reflecting on the results of AI outputs, for example. So that's also something which I see quite often, I think. And people just say, yeah, the AI doesn't do what I wanted. And then if you ask them what they did with the AI, then you know why they didn't work. So
But also getting that definition of what you actually wanted and then taking the time to actually set it up so it can actually perform that thing, right? Uh, there's this. It has to answer fast, or or it doesn't work, right? But sometimes things just takes a little time, right? And it's also that the way we work, right? So just sometimes a slow answer from an AI is better than a quick answer, right? As well.
yeah, and I think it's also as with many leadership problems, because if you don't have a clear problem definition, or maybe just an implicit problem definition that you do not explicate in front of whoever you're working with, then you shouldn't be disappointed if you don't get the results you wanted. So I think a lot of the problems that you face with AI are deeply human.
Mm. Yeah, it is. It's about expecting too much too quickly, right? Just hoping for the best, or uh, And then that leads me to Kate O'Neill in an episode that's coming out in a couple of days. She said that that technical depth is something. Well, depth in general is something we get because we believe in the future. Right. So, do you think we're going to have a lot of technical depth from AI? Oh, I think that's a good question, right?
Yeah, that's really a good question. I think that depends on how willing we are to actually work with the technology, and how willing we are to really invest, like not from a financial side, but from an effort side into it, right?
Mm.
So
Yeah, but the thing is still, if we believe that this will be so good in like 2 or 3 years, right, or 4 or 5 years, we will create something right now where we create something that we know might not necessarily be exactly how we would have done it 3 or 4 years ago, but we do it okay. You say, okay, we take this chance because we believe in the future, and then we take up a debt that might become a technical debt, right?
of course, I think it's that's also a strategical question, because that is also not very different from many other investments that you take. If you don't believe in the future success, you are not willing to make any investments, being it financial investments or upskilling people, or just also changing your strategical objectives, for example. And I think a lot of companies are exactly at that point where they have to decide now, are we focusing on AI or not?
And do they?
Because
Do they then believe in it? Are they focusing? They always say it is. They all say they are, right? You see the surveys, right? Companies all have AI high on the. But do they? What is your honest opinion, Christina? Bash them. What do you think? Do they actually believe in it?
I think that strongly depends on the company, and I think especially in Europe, you have a huge, and you know that this is my favorite topic, but I will try to not talk too much about this. But in Europe, you have lots of regulations, you have lots of things that you're not allowed to do, and of course, potentially you might be outpaced by non-European countries, and that is mirrored in the belief in the future, at least from my experience, because I've talked to many companies in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and also in the United States, and those companies were like, okay, we have to do AI, and we actually, if you're not doing AI, you're gonna get fired, and that's it. And in Europe, it's more like, yeah, we should do AI, but imagine if it doesn't work. And
Mm.
that's a mindset thing, because on the one hand, of course, there's lots of regulations, but I think in Europe, we're used to the fact that it might also not work, or regulations might change, or whatever. So I think in Europe, it's way more difficult to actually believe in a future where we might be competitive with AI. And I think, of course, we also have other problems than just the regulation, but I think that's a huge problem, because it kills all the motivation and all the aspirations that might come from AI.
Do you think we're too stuck up with operational stability, or what is it? Why do we do that? Why do we wait? Why don't we move? Why are we so focused?
I think at least in Germany, there are many countries, many organizations that say, okay, we are market leaders and it's fine, and we have lots of stakes in what we already do. And so if we want to change that, we have to make huge investments, and we have to also kind of switch our focus away from whatever we are doing now. And that also has a high risk. And I think that also is, I don't know if you know the innovators dilemma, and which
Mm.
is that market leaders, right, are usually not, or they have challenges in adopting new technologies. And I think that's what's happening here as well. But it also has some twists, because AI, as we already said, is not the typical technology, but it has way more implications. So you might also see more potentials, because you can move into completely new directions. But I still think that many companies just say the regulations might kill whatever we are trying to do before we actually start it. And there will always be an AI which is stronger and not in the European Union, for example, because we've seen that we are also developing an AI product which will not be allowed in Europe. So we will sell it in different countries, but not every organization can do that, right? And if you look at some organizations, many are already doing that. Many of the organizations are saying, we have, for example, a headquarter in Germany and a headquarter in Saudi Arabia. What are those guys doing? Those guys are putting all the efforts that they have in AI in Saudi Arabia, and they are not doing anything in Germany.
So I guess that on the whole, discussion, regulate, innovate, or I wanted to ask you if that's a binary discussion, whether AI regulation is good or not. But I guess you think it's a bad thing, or what are you missing?
I think it's not only a bad thing, because of course it's like, as with any technology and any new development, maybe you have to put some boundaries to it so that it cannot do everything, but it should be a thoughtful regulation, I think, because what happens at the moment is we regulate things which haven't even been developed, and we put a stop to things that haven't even started. And so I think you should kind of try to create a balance between putting boundaries to, negative developments, but on the other hand, also encouraging innovation and experimentation. And I think that's, if it's done well, it's still the better approach than not regulating at all, because of course it can do huge damage, but not as we are doing it in the European Union at the moment. But that's just my perspective. So
So what are some of these, these inherent advantages of being critical, like being regulated, or because there must be some advantages. You're already getting closer to it. I want to just see what could be the good things of being this critical to technology, because there are some things here, right, that we can trust it a little bit easier. Kate O'Neill, again, actually, she said that regulation is well, without regulation doesn't mean that you don't have any responsibility. It just means that
yeah,
responsibility is all on you, right? So regulation also makes shows you where the highway is, right? And so people can move faster in adoption, right? So there's some a double thing to it. So some of the advantages of this critical or this regulated approach, and some of the dangers, right? What are the problems? I want to get a little bit closer to these dimensions, right? As you said, this is something that's very close to your heart and things you talk about.
yeah, I think that shows the problem of, if you have like rules, for example, in mathematical models, and you just apply them blindly without having any idea what they mean, you might still end up with bias, for example, because a lot of models are still biased. And if you don't reflect on the outcomes, it might harm people. And I think the same is true if you don't have any regulations, for example, if you don't have, or maybe just call it standards or regulations. Because if you have, like, for example, guidelines on which training data should be used, for example, it could at least mitigate bias. You will never completely get rid of it, but that would be something. Or privacy issues, that would be the upside of it. And also, that's what you said as well, is it will help people trust the AI, because what we've seen with DeepSeek as well is, it was a Chinese model, and people said, wow, it's way more powerful. And then we had those two kinds of people. The first kinds of people were like, oh my god, it's powerful, so we're going to use it. And those were many. But then there was the other side saying, okay, but it's not it's on Chinese servers, and we don't know where the data is going. And then Perplexity did something, I think, which was quite clever, because they said, okay, you can use DeepSeek over or via Perplexity, but we are using, I think, American servers. And even if this is not a regulation, it still shows how the idea of, oh, it might be safer, can also make people feel more comfortable and more safe in applying technology. And
Mm.
so I think it might also help people to start with AI in general, or with the application of certain tools, if you have certain boundary conditions where you say, okay, it's not used in this or that, or your data is not going to training data for, I don't know, malicious use, for example. And that's something which helps people to get closer to this, oh my gosh, there's something like a human-like technology now, which is super powerful, and I'm afraid, but I still want to use it, and I still know that I have to use it in the end. But I don't know where my data is going, where...
Yeah, and that's why regulation is good, isn't it? Because then you
Yeah,
know that all the tools you have are vetted against the regulation, and then regulation de facto creates a sort of standard, right?
absolutely. And I think if you look at the EU AI Act, for example, the basic idea behind every regulation is, well, not thought through, but it has some basis, right? They want to, because the European Union, in the end, and that's my point of view, and I hope that's true, wants to protect the user. So, for example, there have been some paragraphs on emotion recognition, so that the AI is not allowed to be used in schools or for work purposes if it can read your emotions. Because of course, what you can do with this, I don't even want to think about that, but only if you use it for the bad. And so that's the point, because what the European Union is doing at the moment is just blocking everything and every usage, even if it might also be used for the good. For example, emotion recognition can also be used to help you when you're feeling lonely. It can help people at work who want to quit or who are depressive. And of course, but that's what I say when I meant you have to have a balance between experimenting and innovating and protecting people. And I think that's where you have to put some more thought into regulations before applying them blindly, just to say, okay, we shut down everything first and then open it up again. Because many other countries are doing it the other way around, but that's also a mindset thing. I don't know if that would work in the European Union, for example.
No, to just have it all open and then start to
Yeah.
shut it down as we go and see something bad. Because there's always this, and I think the European welfare states know this more than anything, right? If you give something a right, it's really difficult, or allowance to be,
Yeah.
it's really difficult to take it away again, right? You can't take
Yeah.
things away again. And that brings me to, there's this whole, this US innovates, China replicates, and Europe
Mhm.
regulates, right?
Mhm.
That's been going the rounds everywhere, right? And uh, and it implies to some extent that the game has been lost, right? Been won by someone else, right? But
Yeah.
I think I'm quite adamant that the game is not about technology. It's about adoption, and it's about how people feel there's some kind of safe adoption of it, and also in the long term, will we feel that the technology we've adopted is actually doing something good for us, or will we be disgruntled consumers, right? And I'm just saying that maybe there's a merit to saying, okay, let's close this down and open it if it makes sense, instead of just saying let's open it all up and then see and then have trouble shutting down the
Yeah.
crappy production because are the things we didn't want, right? There, there's just a different perspective to it, and I think I don't know if you think that if the welfare state analogy resonates with you, but I just thought of that. This whole giving people a right, you can't take it away again. So if you
Yeah.
just say this is non-regulated, do what you want to do, and we'll regulate later, it's really difficult to do that because then you have products, you have companies built on the non-regulated state, right, and all that. What
Yeah.
do you think?
Absolutely. But I think I totally agree with you on all points that you made, but I think it's easy to be or like to take on a perspective where you criticize one of the two approaches. Because actually, if you ask me to argue for either one of them, I would be more than willing to do so. Because on the one hand,
By
of
the way,
course,
Christina is not a GPT, just to let you know. So
don't be so sure.
no, exactly.
No, but all my answers I generated. Thanks
Yeah,
for
exactly. So I can,
listening.
I can argue for whatever you want, just let me know what you want. Certainly, let's do that, Lasse. Come on.
Absolutely. But in this case, I might come very close to GPT because it's on the one hand, if you have the regulation, if you're pro-regulating, for example, I could say, okay, it makes so much sense, because if you have lost trust in a system, in an AI, you will never gain it back, or very, very hardly. And imagine something bad happens without any regulation. So I don't want to imagine what could have happened. So that's one way to put it. But on the other hand, if I was against regulation, I could also say, but just what you pointed out, and I don't want any right to be taken away, and I don't want anyone to feel, I don't know, restricted, and I don't want to be against innovation. And I think it's super hard to actually do the right thing here, because of course you have to get to start somewhere. You have to innovate, because especially due to the fact that like AI is everywhere now, you don't have a market leadership just by being able to employ AI, right? So that's something that has been there with other things, but not with AI. Everyone has AI. Everyone that who has a smartphone now is able to use an AI. And so you cannot say, okay, we're going to regulate. So, or
but that's also, the
like,
whole, what was it? Facebook, who had this, I can't remember the name. Well, sometimes when you search through your mind for a word, you come up with the same thing all the time. And I wanted to talk about this company that sold off data for the election 10 years ago. What was it called? This company that did that on Facebook in the US for the elections. I want to say Battlestar Galactica all the time, but that's just not the right thing, because that's a different thing.
Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, exactly. Cambridge Analytica. I don't know what to say. Why did I want to say Battlestar Galactica? What is that? What's wrong with my mind? But that was, we had a deregulated
close.
market. Yeah, but for some weird reason it is, right. I don't know how or why. This really isn't, right.
Yeah.
But
maybe the probabilities were similar.
but the thing is that we had a deregulated social media platform, and then suddenly it was used for the wrong purpose. And then did we ever recover our trust in it, do you think?
Depends on the people, because I think that there are some kinds of personalities who are very forgiving, but actually I think as a collective we aren't, because I've read a wonderful article on filter bubbles and echo chambers and influencing elections. And the baseline of this article was that there is no scientific proof of actually like formulation of opinions in echo chambers. But the problem is that the baseline of that article was that people are not more influenced, they're just less educated. So there's no proof, even if it's not statistically proven. Again, as just linking it to the initial discussion that we had, it's not about the numbers. Even if Facebook would have shown 2,000 statistics that it wasn't true, if the mental picture of Facebook once got a crack, I think it's hard to fix that. And I think for many people it's the same until today, but of course there's always personality differences. And I think like especially younger people who have grown up with multiple social media platforms are more forgiving in that regard, because they also get a lot out of it. But I think that touches a whole new discussion of how people are educated by now, or how younger
but the young people are not going
educated.
on Facebook. They're doing some other platforms, right? And
That's right.
And some of a sentence that's been growing on me is, will we stop consuming before we are consumed, right? That's the point, right? So if they lose our trust, right, we'll just stop using them, right? Is that? Do you think that's the way? Is that what you're saying, Christina? Or is that the warning to deregulation tech bros, right? Saying that, okay, you deregulate, but now the responsibility is yours, guys, right? Be careful.
It can happen, but I'm not really sure if it really does. For example, we also had this where there've been lots of documentaries like The Social Network and documentaries on TikTok, and you see there's still millions of users. And even the people who worked for those social media platforms and knew, for example, that those platforms didn't want you to be informed, but to be influenced, for example. And they openly said that. And they still had to delete their account because they were not able to kind of get away from it, because they were addicted. And I think that's something that stands against this, we're just going to stop using it. Because sometimes I feel that this whole social media game is something like a toxic relationship. You know, it's not good for you in many cases, and it does harm, and that it's not all butterflies and roses. But in the end, you can't get away. And I think the more educated you are, and the more you are also having conversations and your social life outside these platforms, the more likely it will be that people will stop using it. For example, you and me, I think we don't have so much presence on Facebook. So whenever you see, okay, Facebook's, I don't know, is manipulating data, you're going to just stop using it. That's fine for us. But imagine those people who have all their conversations on, for example, Instagram or TikTok now. And if that would happen to these platforms, then you've seen that when in the US there was this situation where TikTok should be deleted or forbidden. These creators were crying and saying, "Oh my God, we can't do that." And that, I think, showed that by now it's way more than just this typical social network thing of, hey, I'm going to do my little TikTok dance, but it's actually a huge part of your real social life
But you're
right
also
now.
emphasizing this, that if you take something away that's been deregulated, like a right for people, people will
Yeah,
react really aggressively to it, right? This is my
yeah,
livelihood now. You can't just take it away, right?
yeah.
But we decided it was bad, and we wanted to regulate it after the fact, and now we're doing it. Oh, sorry about that,
Mm-hmm.
by the way, right?
Yeah.
But yeah. This is a difficult discussion, right? This consumption and being locked in. And Carl Friston also on the episode said that it was a disease on the brain. I think he called it the whole social media, right? Because it carried these echo chambers that we couldn't get out of, but didn't give us anything new, no curiosity, no expansion, no life really there, right? Um, but you and me, we also, so we, I don't think we'll be that sad if Facebook were to shut up, but maybe LinkedIn a little bit more instead, right? Because we're both there quite a lot, and that's also where we started talking. And I think that, to me, on a platform like LinkedIn or X, or what you're on, the AI hype, right? Business hype also is very semantically loaded, right? And this also
Mm.
reflects on the discussion we've had right now with innovation, regulation, and all that. And phrasing has to always be balanced against whether they end up being for or against AI.
Mm.
And I feel that a lot when I'm writing. I'm always being very, very careful that I'm not being either too too optimistic, like this will happen
Mm-hmm.
in the future, or too pessimistic, this will never work, right? But isn't this, also perhaps a reflection? And we've been speaking about this. You could be both ways, right? It's not binary. You could be Christina GPT that says whatever I want you to say. But isn't this perhaps a reflection that this is truly more complex than just saying LLM to everything? Maybe is this um, what is the discussion we need to have, right? I think that there is something binary in this. The binary discussion seems to be wrong to some extent. That we are constantly having these either or, right?
Absolutely. There's a wonderful book. I'm sorry that I keep recommending books in your
Good.
podcast, but but it's really cool because Kevin Dutton has written a wonderful book which is called Black and White Thinking, and that narrows it down that people are usually very keen on saying either yes or no, and just without putting any dimension into what they're talking about. By the way, that's also what happens on social media, because that's just one way of reducing complexity. But
Mm,
going back to your question, absolutely, because I think the discussion that we should be having is not about AI is good or bad, because that's as if you would say, I don't know, environment is good or bad, because what is an AI? Because as you said, which discussion should we be having now? Because an LLM, generative AI, is not AI in general. And that's why whenever we have a talk on AI, and everyone gets tired of these slides, but we always have one slide in our deck which explains that AI in general is so much more, it can be computer vision, whatever, than LLMs, than generative AI. And of course, it's necessary to talk about it, and many people just need this evaluation of good or bad just for their mental mental models. But
mm.
And I think there are two very important points with, is AI either good or bad? Because the first thing is AI. What are we talking about when it comes to AI? That's what I just said. And the second thing is good or bad, for whom and for what? And I think, of course, you can say, hey, AI is super cool, but you always have to put it into perspective of what you're talking about, because AI is super good for creativity reasons in this and this regard, whatever. That's a way more nuanced way of putting it. If I'm agreeing or not is
Specificity,
different.
specificity,
But
right?
and that's I have this, and I think especially LinkedIn, I have a love-hate relationship with that platform, to be very honest. But LinkedIn is like the market leader in reducing complexity on the wrong way, or in the wrong way, because it's always like the title has to be catchy, and it should emphasize that something's totally different from whatever anyone else is saying. But I think on the one hand it should be way more nuanced, but on the other hand, I think it should still be a conversation that everyone could have. Because the more into detail we go, the more knowledge you need, and the more specific background and expertise you need.
So it
For
seems like you're
example,
saying that, I could just as well have asked you, Christina, is the EU good or bad? Yes or no,
yeah,
right?
exactly. And of course, I could say when it comes to regulation topics in AI, I would say this, and even there, I could say both. But of course, I think it's a good way. Well, reducing complexity is always, or can be, not is always, it can be a sign of intelligence, because it makes more, or gives more people the opportunity to talk about the topic which might be important to them. And I think that might be, or should be, the basic idea whenever you reduce complexity. Because, for example, I think you and me, we both reduce a lot of complexity in our posts as well, for example. Because we want as many people as possible to understand
I feel
what
ashamed of it as well. I feel ashamed of it. I
me too,
do.
but I think the posts are even better than the comment section. So, but still, I think it's still a way of making or giving people the opportunity to kind of reflect upon certain subtopics. But still, of course, I think there should be both, because, of course, as I said, like, there are upsides, and I'm sorry that I keep saying both, but what for me is absolutely missing is this deep conversation about, let's narrow it down to one specific context and then just talk about it, and then just talk it through, and maybe integrate experts. For example, if you would want to talk about the functionality of LLMs with me, I could say, okay, from a user perspective, from a psychologist perspective, and also maybe from a management perspective, I can tell you what I think, and from an AI advisor perspective. But I could never, and I would never, have this discussion on a technological level. And that's something which, especially with AI, is super important. You have to gather experts around you to actually be able to talk about everything in detail, because no one will ever know the whole game of AI. I'm
But
totally
one of the worst questions I've ever had was when I did a workshop and someone said, "But I expected some, very concrete use cases about how can I go home and this will change my world right now." And I was like, "Yeah, but the problem is that what I'm set here to do is to give some a generic thing for a break, so an open workshop for a big audience, right? And I can't tell you exactly how your world will be changed by AI, because that requires a completely different, breaking it down conversation in your reality, right? It depends, it depends, right? All those things. Uh, but why was this a terrible comment? I could just throw it out. It doesn't matter. She doesn't get the point of an open workshop. But because I always know these complexities that I'm overlooking whenever I'm doing something generic, or whenever I'm writing a LinkedIn post, or whenever I'm doing a presentation, all the things I'm sort of covering over or just hovering over that I'm not going into the depths with, right? So is that the problem of being this? Should you be more binary, Christina?
whenever it comes to binary things, it always or often gets down to the level that you have to decide whether you want to be binary and still make people feel as if they could trust you by saying yes or no, or by neglecting your own intellectual background, maybe by saying I'm neglecting so much. And we have that problem a lot because, of course, I'm also writing research papers in my university job.
Mm.
And there's no such thing that A always leads to B, because
No.
it's always these ceteris paribus assumptions that whenever you keep everything else constant, um, then you have that result. And especially in AI, you have that problem that, of course, this thing was you did a more binary thing, but it made everyone at least understand what you were talking about. On the other hand, if someone wants something super specific, you might need a second chance to explain him or her what you mean. And that's a super hard thing whenever it comes to AI, because everyone wants this solution for their own life when it comes to AI. And every organization wants their perfect use case. And the problem is, whenever you, for example, say, give me the perfect use case for my organization, even if you know the organization, you might still not know the person who asks the question. And then it might be the perfect use case for the organization, but not for the leader who asked the question. And so this complexity cannot be reduced by 100%, but I think making it a bit more binary in many cases helps people understand the basic idea behind it. And after gaining their trust and their curiosity, you should then or could then enter in a more nuanced discussion. That's at least what I do most of the cases.
Well, I think that's a. I think it's there's no real solution to this, right? But I think it's a brilliant discussion around it, right? Also, sometimes you need binary, messaging to say, the yes or no's for this to sort of get the conversation started. But then also quickly go, it depends. Let's see what it can do for you, right? Let's talk about the problem. Let's talk about the outcome. Let's talk about anything but the technology, right? Because the technology ends up often being binary in the way we're talking about it. Um, it's like
But
talking about the pen, right? Instead of talking about the problem.
yeah, but in the end, and that's something that one one C-suite member told me after work or before workshop and after it again, because he approached me before the workshop and said, okay, I've seen your slides because we sent them in advance. And he said, I don't see that I'm getting anything out of this workshop today, but thanks for your effort. And I hope you're going to convince me otherwise. And that was the start of the workshop. And as you can
Thank you for
imagine,
a
I was,
boost of self-confidence. Yes.
exactly. But in the end, and that was one thing that was one big learning for me, because we of course we started with a more like binary discussion, then entered into a more binary discussion, into a more nuanced discussion. But in the end, and that was what convinced him in the end, we came back to, in the end, against what we just talked about. This is our answer to your question, and that was a yes or no, and that was what we should do, because he said in the end, I'm a C-suite member, and in the end, I have to say yes or I have to say no, and then I have to say yes to the 50 million or no to the 50 million. But I cannot say it depends. And that's something which is super crucial. And I think that's where research and practice always has communication problems, because research always says, well, but you have to put the context in. Well, you have to have a look at the context first. And you can never say yes or no, because it's never yes or no, even in the real world, not in models, and never. Well, sometimes in models, but that's the problem that like practice has, because they say, yeah, that's beautiful that you just said, like, if you say this and this and this and this, then it might be maybe. That doesn't help me. And so that's, I think, where not only with AI, research and practice have to kind of move a bit towards each other to find a common ground.
Yeah, the clear confidence, in the end, saying that this is the right thing to do. This pressure because you need to make a decision, right? There can't be this
Yeah.
indecision, this waiting, 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 waiting. We have to do something. We have to make an action, right? sort of like a Habermasian, or I don't even know how you say that in English, Habermasian adoption of AI, right? Let's just talk about it for 50 years, right? We have to come to a place
Hmm.
where someone can make a binary decision on it, right? That's what you're saying. So it is difficult to start binary, then move into nuance, and then you have to end binary again. Or is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you want to do, because sometimes,
It depends.
some, yeah, because I think I always want to give some context, because whenever it comes to AI, I think there is no right or wrong by now. And you can always be wrong saying this might be the right way to go, because there's so much insecurity. But I would want to put my yes into context whenever I say yes, because we are AI, well, people say we are AI experts and they trust our decisions. But that's why I say start binary, then put some context around it, and then end binary. Is I would never want anyone to say, hey, you said yes, and in the end it was not correct. And then I could just say, yeah, that was no gut feeling, by the way. I had some ideas in mind, but I never told you this. And
Mm.
so this, I think there's, whenever it comes to AI, sometimes you have to take risks. And then you have to say yes, even if you're absolutely not
Mhm.
sure.
So
But
yeah, so the sign here, and then there's a 50-page assumption paper afterwards, right?
yeah, but yeah, sometimes it's just, and by the way, so many people are still making gut based decisions, even with AI. So come
Yeah, but
on.
that's what that is exactly what Laurie and Pratt also said on the podcast, right? We talked about the hippo and people, the highest paid person's opinion still matters. Even though we have AI and data and everything to make the right decision, we still make decisions based on, what do I feel will
Yeah,
be the right thing to do, right?
absolutely.
That is again back to what I said before, that we have amazing power but very little influence from these technologies. There's this discrepancy that's super weird, right? They can do everything, but we don't use them for the things that we should use them for, but we use them to create a lot of weird photos on social media platforms instead, right? But
Yeah.
but I want to ask you also. Now you brought the C-suite, right? In 2025, right? Beyond these initially rather shallow AI strategies that were pushed to companies, I think I heard someone previously on the show also said that he's seen two companies who had the same strategy, right? What should be a good AI strategy in 2025? Now that we know a bit more.
It should not only be an AI strategy, I
Mm,
think, because whenever people say we're going to have an AI strategy, they are thinking of which tools to use, which licenses to buy, etc. And I think a good AI strategy should be human centric, because you still work with humans in the foreseeable future. And the people working with AI are still humans in the foreseeable future. Of course, we have agents, but in many cases, they are still humans. Um, and I think they should, as what we touched upon, still be ethical. And so think about what should or should not be done. And I think an AI strategy should be way more agile and adaptive than many other strategies that we've been talking about in, for example, I don't know, books that we read in university. So you don't make a plan for the next 3 years anymore. You make a plan maybe for 1 year, but you reiterate and reflect upon the strategy, I don't know, each month, maybe every 2 weeks, depending on what you're working on.
mm.
And that's something which I
Then
think
becomes
you
more
should focus
tactical,
on.
doesn't it? Then it's more tactical. It's not really strategic,
Yeah.
is it?
Yeah, you should still have an idea where you want to go, but you should still reflect against current developments if the strategy is still pointing in the right direction.
Because things are moving so
Because
fast.
exactly, and it's gonna start moving even fast. And I was at a leadership workshop, and Michael Watkins, he's a professor at the IMD. He also said before we had like strategy circles every, I think, year, and now they have it every 30 days, I think.
Mm.
And so that's everything's working, is going fast now, but especially AI is super fast.
But that's interesting, right? That's also sort of the death of I don't know, death of stability or something. I think it always, when people say that now we are reevaluating the things that is our long term structures all the time. I always go back to the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who wrote The State of Exception, about how when we are changing the law all the time, we don't have a rule of law. So if we change it every month or every 2 or 3 months, we are basically living in a state of exception all the time, and nothing is really structured enough for us to make long-term investments. So, and if AI strategies change all the time, is it even possible for us to make these long-term AI investments that we at the same time want people to do, Christina?
I think it is, because it depends on how you approach this strategy. Because if you want to say, okay, by the end of 2025, I want goal XYZ, AI literacy in my company. I want higher AI usage. I want AI agents employed, and so on. Um, this might be a goal that doesn't change, but you have to reiterate the goals, how you get towards these bigger goals. And so I think you should still have an idea where you want to go. We should not change this fast. For example, what we keep preaching is that people need certain skills and capabilities to be able to sustainably work with AI. Um, and that shouldn't change in the long run. What should change is, are we using DeepSeek? Are we using ChatGPT? Are we having this project or this project?
Mm.
And I think that's what you should constantly reiterate. And that's where speed can also kind of give some stability. Imagine riding a bicycle. If you're slow, you might still wobble around. And if you have some speed, it kind of gets you into the right direction. But you have to get used to this reiteration processes.
Well, but then strategy is also, the long term. We want our people to be informed about what's going on,
Yeah,
right? While the tactical approach is always changing, new tools, new things, right? So isn't that's what you meant, right? Essentially, isn't it?
exactly.
So you have a degree in psychology, Christina. I need to ask you, what drove you to AI, and how is that background influencing your work? I know you said people, 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 but that's not exactly necessarily what a psychologist would always say. Just no matter what people think.
You're absolutely right with that. Well, I've always been interested in the intersection of technology and human beings. And so, funnily, I always wanted to know how people work, not because I wanted to be able to control them, but because I wanted to understand why are there so many things which are kind of the same between human beings. And that's why I started studying psychology. But in the end, I always knew that I never wanted to be a psychotherapist, because I think there are millions of people who are better in this than I am. And that's why I also studied management. So I have degrees in both. And then in management, there was this very, in many cases, this very rule based, um, assumption based way of seeing the world. And there were so many models that if this happens, then this happens. And then back then I already saw that this model doesn't necessarily always work when you have human beings like in the room. And especially with AI, that had a completely new dimension, because funnily I was back in, I think, 2021 or 22, no, 22, when ChatGPT just came out. I was in a small cafe in Stockholm with my husband, and we were talking about the implications of ChatGPT for research. And that's where we actually directly started becoming interested in AI, is that we saw that it would lead to fundamental changes in human behavior, human decision making. And the paradox thing is that a technology leads to fundamental changes in human behavior. And that was what completely triggered me. And so that was why I decided to dig deeper into AI, because I think this dimension is still not fully covered.
How is it changing the human behavior now? Now I'm intrigued.
Well, I think, for example, before, knowledge was power, but is it really still power if you have it in your pocket? And I think that was a discussion that already started when we had Google. But back then, when we did not have Google at our hands, we would learn completely differently. For example, we would have to go to a library and choosing what's important, what's not important. We would have to filter knowledge to actually be able to use it, and we would have to decide what to keep in mind, what to maybe forget. We would have to read
Mm.
through thousands of pages, which were totally irrelevant. But that's where we gained bits of knowledge, which would then help us in other contexts. And now imagine you grow up with ChatGPT, for example. So whatever question you pose, and actually I've tried to, because you sent me some of the questions in advance, um, to put it into ChatGPT, and actually those answers were amazing. And you wouldn't have needed me for the podcast anymore if I didn't decide to not take the
Mm.
answers into the podcast. But jokes aside, it can amazingly filter knowledge. It can substitute lots of things that humans thought were purely human.
But what you would you said something interesting, that we thought that the knowledge was power, and now we have it in our pockets. But we have also seen now that this knowledge as well has is power still if someone manipulates it just slightly, right? The whole Web 2.0 thing where we just get ads and for free stuff was just the power was almost profanely, commercial, right? Just yeah, you can get this information that I can get money for giving you, right? But now there is, I think, I think I'm not alone seeing a tendency that information can be used to for different reasons. For if the whole thing was everything we presented, we can't necessarily trust it. Technology is not it's moving a little bit away from this neutrality of just purely commercial ad related interest into more political interest, right? We've seen that with the whole big tech moving into almost moving in with the White House, right? Being on the front row in the inauguration, right? And no opinion on that on this podcast here, but the point is that they're turning political, right? So
Yep.
knowledge is still power, and now we've all sort of over the last 20, 20, 30 years adopted technology, right? This technology trusted that it was just for the ads. But are we being fooled, tricked?
Yeah, maybe in some regards, I think we definitely are. But and to your point, I think knowledge is still power, but not only before. It was just the pure access to knowledge. So
Mm.
if you knew something, you were powerful. Now you can get access to many different kinds of knowledge within seconds.
Yeah, but now you don't have
But
attention. Now attention is power, right? So
yeah, but it
you're
always was power. But
yeah.
that's the thing. Attention was always power. And there's this saying like where attention goes, energy flows. That's still right. That has always been right. But now you have so many distractions that, of course, like the price to attention is way higher than it was before, and the attention spans is I think it's decreasing because someone told me that, but I have no scientific proof of that. But um, it's not very very big. So of course, but that's the thing. Sometimes I don't even know if like this flood of information is always the best way to gain back our own power, because that doesn't really help us in reflecting, because reflection needs some space. And I think that's some skill, for example, that's kind of still incredibly important, especially against the background of or backdrop of this millions of bits of information that try to get your attention, because you have to reflect upon them and judge them.
Mm.
But the more information you get, the harder it gets to get this distance to everything that's around you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I really like that reflection needs space, right? I think that is not what we're leaving for. We don't leave room for that in any kind of social media flux or even my problem with the large language models is that I use them to sort of when I get into a block or something like that I can use them to sort of move me on as a brainstorming partner. I do that a lot. I like to write my own ideas and then see if it can sort of add nuances to it that makes it deeper.
Yeah.
Sometimes, right? But sometimes maybe I should just give myself space to think it out myself, right? And I don't even know what I'm losing there, right? there's this whole now because you studied psychology, I have a thought, right, and I really want to push it out there. I've been wanting to do that for a long time because some years ago, a lot of my friends read a lot of Lacanian theory, psychoanalysis, right? Which is sounds like I have weird friends, but I don't know. They're just very smart, I think, because it's really difficult stuff, right? But he talks about the big other, right? That there's this big other out there in society that you sort of you get anxiety if you feel there's a crack in it or a discrepancy between how you envision the world and how the world actually is and the structures of it. There's some big other out there, like we could give it to God or we could give it to society, we give it to all these things that are sort of structuring everything around us. And I think that to some extent, right, there's this weird thing with the large language models that they sort of encompasses all of these structures, right? They're trained on them to create these big bias networks um, that that has this great other feeling, big other feeling that they're all the things that are in our structures. So when they talk back to us, they talk back to us from a position of being comforting because they reinforce all the things that are already there in the structures of society, right? But then when they miss it, there's this anxiety about why do you don't you understand this? A small thing, right? I, are they the great other? I think that's an interesting thing. I think are they reinforcing it? Are they being some kind of other than the great other, or the big other? It's called in English. What do you think? I don't know. I don't know if this question even makes sense, right? But
It does make sense. I That's a really good question. And actually, I feel tempted to say yes or no now, but that's exactly where reflection should come in first. So I think it's not easy to answer that because in the end, it's just a technology. But what we make of it is something totally different. And that's maybe the idea behind this, because actually what is there, like, objectively is not the point in the end. It's what we interpret into it. And I
mm,
think depending on who you are, you could definitely see it as something which would at least come close to this concept, I would say. But that's something, and I've thought about this actually, some, like, not in this phrasing, but in this basic idea for a long time, and I have never found a satisfying answer.
no, I think I said in that episode with Kate O'Neill because I found out she was a linguist during the episode, and she said that it was. I know I asked her if this was, the signifiant to all the signifiers in the world. It was something that was loosely not connected. It was not in the world, but it was the ideas of all the things in the world gathered here, right? So there's something with these large language models being almost a synthesized structure of the world of the human
Yeah,
civilization, right? Are they a hack on our civilization, or are they just a synthetic form of it? And what do we do with that? There's something, can we just start using a synthetic form of the world? Is that safe? I think,
I don't know.
no, no, but there's so many questions here that I think actually
Yeah,
deserves an unraveling, right? And yes, I would be tempted to say let's regulate it before we just go down the route because we have no clue what's going on there, right? But
yeah,
because it sound when I say it this way, it sounds very very dangerous, right? Because it's super powerful that way. It is
yeah.
a superpower in the mind of a human and in the mind of all humans, right?
Couldn't agree more.
But Christina, sorry, I had to throw that idea out there. I thought it was interesting, and I still think I still think about it. So I'll
Definitely.
keep it. But I think this has been a great conversation, Christina. I've loved having you on the show. Uh,
Me too.
and
Thank you.
uh, and I have one final question for you, and I hope you're ready for that one.
I am.
So, Christina, what is the only constant?
In my opinion, the only constant is the ongoing struggle between human aspirations and the basic human nature. Because that's exactly what you said, is that humanity has always been fighting with the tension between super high ambitions, that we want to progress, we want to discover things, we want to innovate, we want to be the best version of ourselves, And then there's our nature, where we are fearful, where we have biases, where we are lazy, and where we are reluctant to change. And I think this is a struggle which will never be solved, because we will always strive for more, but at the same time not really be willing to give up everything that we would have to give up to actually accomplish each and every goal. And you see that in basic principles like going to the gym 7 days a week and becoming a fitter person. But it's also in AI. We want AI to be the hero of each and every generation. We want AI to cure diseases, to tackle the climate crisis, to be the solution for everything. But at the same time, we worry about AI replacing us, we worry about AI costing us our jobs or our status in society. And I think that's something which will always be there, this inherent tension.
That's a really good answer, and it also resonates with the conversation we've had. You put yourself, squarely in between a couple of positions about human nature and ambition, right? It depends, Christina, right? And it also echoes with some of the previous constant. I think Tom Goodwin said human nature, right, basically is the only constant, right? And we're still lazy and we're still crappy and all that. He was very, very direct in that. But I think it's a brilliant constant. I love to put the tension there, because that's more true than any absolute entity or a thing in our nature, right? So this was a really great conversation, Christina, and thank you so much for it, and thank you for your only constant.
Thank you so much, Lasse. Looking forward to everything that's following.
You've listened to The Only Constant, a podcast sponsored by Basico.